James Walker had always believed that peace was something you had to earn. After 25 years as a police officer, he thought he had finally done enough to deserve it. Every morning he'd wake up to the sound of birds outside his window, stretch his back a little and smile at the sight of his quiet suburban street. His house wasn't huge or fancy, but it was his dream come true. A cozy home with a big backyard, a small garden, and a brand new swimming pool that shimmered under the Georgia sun. When he first moved into the neighborhood, people seemed friendly enough. Some waved when he passed by. A few even came over with cookies or a plate of barbecue to welcome him. He liked that. He didn't talk much about his time in the force, and most of his neighbors didn't ask. They just knew he was retired and liked to keep to himself. That suited him perfectly. Most days, James spent his mornings tending to the little things that made his home feel alive, watering his tomato plants, checking the filter on the pool, or sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and the newspaper. He had seen too much chaos in his years on the job. Now peace was his best friend. The backyard pool was his sanctuary. It wasn't just a luxury. It was a symbol of how far he'd come from the stress and danger of his old life. Then, one afternoon, as he was trimming the hedges along his fence, he noticed a woman he hadn't met before walking her dog near his house. She was in her late 40s with neatly styled blonde hair and a confident way of moving that said she liked being noticed. She gave him a short wave, then looked over his fence toward the pool. Her expression lingered there just a little too long, like she was sizing it up. James didn't think much of it at the time. He nodded politely and went back to his gardening. A few days later, she showed up again, this time stopping to talk. "You must be the new neighbor," she said brightly, tugging at the leash of her small white dog. "I'm Linda. I live just down the street. Lovely pool you've got there." "Thanks," James said with a polite smile. "Took me a while to save up for it," she chuckled. "Well, I'm sure it's worth it in this heat. We could all use a dip now and then." James gave a small laugh, thinking she was just making conversation. "Yeah, that's for sure," he said. He didn't realize then that she wasn't just being friendly, she was planting a seed. Over the next few weeks, James noticed Linda more and more. She always seemed to be outside when he was, walking her dog slower and slower each time she passed his house. Sometimes she'd stop to ask questions about his yard or compliment his rose bushes. It was harmless at first, but one afternoon when he came home from running errands, something felt off. His backyard gate was slightly open. The pool cover had been pushed aside, and there were wet footprints leading from the edge of the water to the patio. James frowned. Maybe it was kids. It wasn't uncommon for teenagers to sneak into backyards during summer. He checked around but didn't see anyone. The next morning he installed a small lock on the gate and tried not to think about it too much. A few days later, he was sitting on his porch reading when he heard laughter coming from the backyard. For a second, he thought it might be the TV from inside, but when he looked up, he could clearly hear splashing and voices. He stood, heart pounding, and walked toward the noise. Through the side gate, he could see two women lounging on floaties in his pool like they owned the place. One of them was Linda. James froze, stunned. She was wearing sunglasses, sipping from a can of soda, and chatting with another woman as if they were at a resort. His pool toys were scattered around, and a towel he didn't recognize was draped over his chair. He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Excuse me," he said firmly, stepping into view. Linda looked over casually. "Oh, hey, James. Hope you don't mind, we were just cooling off. It's so hot out today." James blinked, unsure if she was serious. "You're in my pool," he said slowly. "Without permission." Linda laughed like he'd told a joke. "Oh, come on. It's just water. We're neighbors. It's not a big deal." "It is a big deal," he replied, his voice even but cold. "This is my property." She gave a dismissive wave. "Don't be so uptight. We'll be out soon." James stood there for a moment, watching the two women continue to float around like he wasn't even there. Every instinct in his body told him to demand they leave immediately, but a small voice in his head said, "Don't lose your cool. Not here, not like this." After a tense minute, he turned and walked back into the house. From the kitchen window, he watched as they stayed another 20 minutes before finally gathering their things and leaving through the side gate. They didn't even bother to lock it behind them. That night, James couldn't sleep. He'd spent his life dealing with people who didn't respect boundaries, who thought rules didn't apply to them. He thought retirement would free him from that, but somehow it had followed him home. The next morning he ordered new private property signs online and a better gate lock. When they arrived, he installed them himself. A week passed peacefully. Then another. James started to think maybe Linda had gotten the message. But just as he was starting to relax, it happened again. This time he caught her as she was leaving. She froze when she saw him standing by the fence, arms crossed. "Linda," he said slowly. "What did I tell you last time?" She rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't be dramatic. It's just a pool." "I don't see why you're making such a fuss." "It's not about the pool," he said. "It's about respect," she smirked. "Respect? I'm not hurting anyone. Besides, you weren't even home. That doesn't make it okay." She shrugged, clearly not caring. "You've got a nice setup, James. Maybe don't flaunt it if you don't want people to enjoy it." That comment hit him harder than he expected. He'd worked his whole life for what he had. Every bruise, every sleepless night, every tough call, it all led to this quiet little home. And here was someone treating it like a public park. After she left, he sat in his backyard for a long time, watching the sunlight ripple across the water. For a man who'd spent decades keeping the peace, he felt powerless in his own home. But he wasn't the kind to act out of anger. He knew patience was stronger than rage. He started documenting everything. Every time he saw her near his fence. Every time the gate was open. Every unfamiliar sound from his backyard. He didn't plan to use it yet, but he had a feeling he might need proof someday. One evening, as he was grilling dinner, another neighbor, Mrs. Green, walked over with a plate of cornbread. She was a kind woman, always checking in on folks. As they chatted, she mentioned almost casually that she'd seen Linda by the pool a few times when James wasn't home. "I thought maybe you'd invited her," she said gently. "But when I saw her bringing guests, I figured something was off." James sighed. "Yeah, you figured right," Mrs. Green frowned. "That woman has no shame. You should do something about it." "I will," he said, nodding, "but the right way." That night, James sat on his porch long after the sun went down. The neighborhood was quiet, but his mind wasn't. He thought about all the times he'd told young officers that patience was a kind of power. The one who stays calm, he'd said, is the one who keeps control. He realized now he'd have to take his own advice. Over the next few days, he reinforced his fence and adjusted the camera angles around his property. He didn't want to fight, he just wanted peace. But it was clear that peace would have to be protected. He started spending more time outside, making sure his presence was known. Whenever Linda passed by, he gave her a polite nod, but nothing more. She seemed irritated by that, like she couldn't stand being ignored. The pool remained empty for a while, but he could feel the tension building, like a storm waiting to break. One Saturday morning, as he was mowing the lawn, Linda stopped on the sidewalk again. "You don't have to be so cold, you know," she said loudly over the hum of the mower. "We could have been friends." James turned off the machine and looked at her. "Friends don't cross fences without asking," he said simply. She smirked but said nothing more. As she walked away, James had a feeling she wasn't done with him yet. He went back to mowing, the steady rhythm of the machine drowning out his thoughts. Still, deep down he knew this wasn't the end. Something told him that Linda wasn't the kind of person who learned lessons easily. But James Walker had faced tougher battles before, and he wasn't about to lose the peace he had worked so hard to earn. A few quiet weeks went by, and for a while James thought maybe things had finally settled down. The weather was cooler, the kids in the neighborhood had gone back to school, and the streets were calm again. He was beginning to enjoy his peaceful routine, morning walks, coffee on the porch, and quiet evenings watching the sunset. He almost started to believe that maybe Linda had learned her lesson. Then one afternoon, as he came home from the grocery store, he noticed something strange again. His backyard gate, locked that morning, was hanging slightly open. His stomach sank. He set down the grocery bags and walked carefully toward the back. The sound of laughter drifted through the air, and as soon as he rounded the corner, there it was again. Linda. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 kids were splashing in the pool while she lounged on a chair, scrolling through her phone. A cooler sat beside her filled with drinks, and there were towels thrown across his patio furniture like it was a public pool. James froze for a moment, trying to stay calm. He took a deep breath before walking forward. "Linda," he said, keeping his voice level. She looked up, clearly startled at first, but then her expression changed into that same smug smile he remembered.
"Oh, hey there,"
she said cheerfully, like nothing was wrong. "You're home early." "Yeah," James replied. "And you're trespassing again." Linda sighed and stood up. "Oh, come on, James, don't make this a big deal. The kids just wanted to swim. You've got such a nice pool sitting empty all day. I figured you wouldn't mind." "I do mind," he said firmly. "You can't just come onto someone else's property without permission." "That's not how it works," her tone changed quickly. "You don't have to be rude about it," she said, folding her arms. "You think you own the whole neighborhood just because you put up a few signs? We're neighbors. This kind of thing is normal." "Normal?" James repeated, struggling to believe what he was hearing. "No, it's not normal, Linda. It's disrespectful." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. You're overreacting. No one's hurting anything." James pointed at the empty soda cans and wet footprints across his deck. "You've already hurt something. My trust." Linda shrugged and started gathering her things, but she did it slowly, as if she were doing him a favor. The kids whined about leaving, and she shot him a look that said she blamed him for ruining their fun. When they finally left through the side gate, she slammed it hard enough to make the fence rattle. James stood there for a long time after they were gone. The pool water was still rippling from where the kids had been splashing. He felt a heaviness in his chest, not anger exactly, but something deeper. Disappointment, maybe. He had spent his life helping people understand boundaries and respect. Now he couldn't even get his own neighbor to follow the simplest rule. That night he sat at his kitchen table, staring at his notepad. He had started writing down dates, times, and small details, like when the gate was left open or when he saw her walking by. He wasn't sure what he'd do with it yet, but keeping records made him feel more in control. It reminded him of his old job, when facts and evidence spoke louder than words. The next day he called the homeowners association to ask if they could step in. The woman on the phone was polite but hesitant. "We can send a reminder about respecting property lines," she said. "But it's really up to you to contact local authorities if it keeps happening." He thanked her and hung up. He didn't want to bring the police into it, not yet. He knew how quickly things could escalate, and the last thing he wanted was a neighborhood spectacle. He hoped she'd back off once she realized he wasn't letting it slide, but Linda didn't seem the type to take quiet warnings seriously. A few days later, James came home again to find something new, one of his pool floats missing. He looked around and spotted it 2 houses down, floating in her backyard pool. It was the same bright blue float he had bought for his granddaughter when she visited. That was it. James walked down the street, calm but determined. He stopped at her fence and called out, "Linda, we need to talk." She appeared a moment later wearing sunglasses and holding a glass of lemonade. "What now?" she said with a tired sigh, as if he were the problem. "You took something from my yard," he said, pointing toward the float in her pool. "I'd like it back," she laughed lightly. "Oh, that? My kids borrowed it." "Chill out, James, you can have it back whenever." "You didn't ask," he said evenly. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she muttered, pulling the float from the pool. "Here, take it. Happy now?" He took it, but her tone stayed with him long after he walked home. It wasn't just the act, it was the complete lack of respect. She genuinely didn't see that she was wrong. That evening he talked to a couple of other neighbors during a walk. It turned out he wasn't the only one she had issues with. One man said she had complained about the color of his mailbox. Another said she had let her dog run loose in his yard. Everyone had a Linda story, but no one had ever pushed back. James realized he might have to be the first. The next weekend, he spent a full day improving his security setup. He installed a motion light, adjusted the cameras, and replaced the gate lock with a more secure one. He even printed out a small sign that read, "No trespassing, violators will be reported." He didn't do it out of spite. He did it to protect his peace. That evening, as he sat by the pool watching the sunset, he felt a little calmer. The neighborhood was quiet again and the air was cool. He hoped that maybe, just maybe, this would be enough. But peace never lasted long around Linda. A few nights later, just after 9 p.m., the motion light flicked on. James looked up from the book he was reading and glanced toward the backyard camera feed. A figure was moving near the pool. His stomach tightened. He stood and walked quietly to the back door. When he looked outside, he saw her again, Linda, standing near the water holding a flashlight. She was talking on her phone, pacing by the pool like she was inspecting it. James opened the door. "Linda," he called out, his voice cutting through the dark. "What are you doing?" She jumped, clearly startled, then tried to cover it with a laugh. "Oh, I was just checking something," she said quickly. "I thought I heard an animal or something. On my property?" "Well, yeah, the gate was open. I was trying to help." "The gate wasn't open until you opened it," he said firmly. "You need to leave, now." Her expression hardened. "You don't have to talk to me like that," she snapped. "I'm just being neighborly. You're making a big deal out of nothing." "This is my home, Linda," he said. "If you step foot here again without my permission, I'll have to report it." She scoffed. "Oh, so now you're threatening me? Typical. You think you can intimidate people because you used to be a cop?" The words hit him like a slap. He took a slow breath, refusing to be baited. "I'm not trying to intimidate anyone," he said. "I'm asking for basic respect." She muttered something under her breath and stormed out, slamming the gate behind her. James stood in the quiet backyard for a long moment after she left. The pool water reflected the porch light, calm and still again. But inside, he could feel the storm brewing. He went inside and sat at his desk, opening his folder of notes. He added another line. October 8, 9:05 p.m. Caught Linda trespassing again. Verbal warning issued. Then he downloaded the security footage from that night and saved it to a separate folder. He didn't want to go to the authorities yet, but he knew now that if it came to that, he'd be ready. As the days passed, the tension between them grew thicker. She'd glare at him when they passed each other on the street. Once he heard her complaining to another neighbor about how some people think they own the block. He ignored it. He'd spent a lifetime dealing with words worse than that, but deep down he knew this wasn't over. He could feel it. Linda wasn't done testing him, and he wasn't done protecting his peace. James looked out at his pool that evening, the water still and perfect under the porch light. He thought about how much he had loved this place when he first moved in, how proud he'd felt building something of his own. He wasn't about to let anyone take that from him. The next few weeks felt tense in the neighborhood. James went about his routine as usual, but things didn't feel the same anymore. The peace that once surrounded his home now felt fragile, like a bubble that could burst any moment. Even the quiet mornings with coffee on the porch seemed different. He'd catch himself glancing toward the fence more often, half expecting to see movement, half hoping he wouldn't. For a while, Linda stayed out of sight. Maybe his firm warning had finally gotten through. The cameras, the motion light, the new lock. He figured she must have realized he wasn't someone who'd ignore her behavior anymore. That gave him a little comfort. But it also made him cautious. He knew people like her, ones who didn't like being told no. They didn't just let things go. They waited for the right time to push back. One sunny afternoon, James was outside skimming leaves from the pool when another neighbor, Peter, stopped by. Peter was a quiet man in his 60s who lived across the street. He leaned on the fence and said, "Heard there was a bit of trouble a while back." James smiled faintly. "Yeah, you could say that," Peter nodded. "She's been talking," he said, lowering his voice. "Said you were overreacting. Something about you trying to control the neighborhood." James chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I just want to be left alone." "I know," Peter said. "We all do. But you did the right thing standing your ground. She's been getting on everyone's nerves lately." That made James feel a little better. At least he wasn't the only one dealing with her attitude. Still, he didn't like being the center of gossip. He'd spent his whole career trying to stay calm in stressful situations. But dealing with this woman in retirement was testing him more than anything on the job ever had. The next week, he decided to have his daughter and granddaughter over for a visit. They hadn't been there since the last incident, and he wanted to show them that everything was fine now. He grilled some burgers, played old music on the patio speakers, and even let his granddaughter splash around in the pool while he watched from a chair. For a while, it felt like old times, laughter, sunlight, and peace. But peace didn't last long around Linda. As the afternoon stretched on, James noticed movement near the fence. He looked up and saw her peeking over, pretending to water her plants on the other side. His granddaughter noticed too and waved innocently, but James just gave a polite nod. He didn't want to make a scene in front of his family. Later, after they left, he went to lock the gate and found that someone had moved one of his potted plants near the fence, just slightly, as if someone had stepped on it or brushed past. He knew it wasn't the wind. His gut told him she'd been there again, watching, maybe even testing him. That night, he rechecked the camera footage. Sure enough, there it was, just before sunset, a shadow moving near the back fence. The figure was blurry, but the outline was clear enough to recognize. It was her. He sat back in his chair and exhaled. "Enough's enough," he muttered. The next morning, he went to the hardware store and bought a taller lock and a small "No Trespassing, Cameras in Use" sign. He wasn't angry. He was tired. Tired of having to guard his own peace like it was something that could be stolen. Days went by quietly again. Then one Friday evening, as he was reading in the living room, his phone buzzed with a motion alert from the backyard camera. He opened the app and there it was, Linda again. This time she wasn't swimming or lounging. She was taking pictures, standing by the pool pointing her phone at his property like she was gathering evidence for something. James's jaw tightened. He stepped outside and called out, "Linda, what are you doing?" She turned, startled for just a second, then crossed her arms. "I'm taking pictures," she said. "You've got cameras pointed toward my property and I'm documenting it." James frowned. "The cameras are on my fence. They don't point at your house." "Well, they feel like they do," she said sharply. "I have a right to privacy." He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "You've been sneaking into my yard for weeks and now you're worried about privacy?" She lifted her chin. "Don't twist this around. You're the one acting like a watchdog. People are starting to talk." "I'm just protecting my home," he said evenly. "You should try respecting other people's boundaries." Her eyes narrowed. "You know, not everyone likes your attitude, James. You think because you used to wear a badge you can boss people around." "I'm not bossing anyone," he said. "I'm asking you to follow the law." She scoffed and walked off, muttering something under her breath. James just stood there, the cool evening air doing little to ease his frustration. He went inside, replayed the footage again, and saved it. Every time something happened, he made sure to document it. Years of police work had taught him one thing: always keep records. Over the next few days, she stopped speaking to him altogether. When he passed her on the street, she'd turn away or pretend to be on her phone. That was fine by him. Silence was better than conflict. But then came the complaints. It started with a letter from the Homeowners Association. Someone had filed a nuisance report about unfriendly behavior and surveillance equipment. The note didn't mention her name, but James didn't need to guess. He called the HOA office, and the woman on the line sounded apologetic. "We just have to follow up on all reports," she said. "If your cameras aren't violating privacy, you have nothing to worry about." "They're not," he assured her. "They're for security. That's all." "Then you're fine," she said kindly. "Some people just like to stir things up." After hanging up, James sat back in his chair and rubbed his temples. This was getting ridiculous. He wasn't the type to pick fights. He just wanted to live peacefully. But it was clear now that she wasn't going to stop until she made herself the victim in her own story. That weekend, he noticed her walking past again with her dog. She didn't look at him, but he could feel her eyes on the fence. The tension had turned into a quiet standoff, each waiting for the other to make the next move. James decided to focus on what he could control. He spent his evenings reading, tending to his plants, and taking long walks. The more he focused on calm, the less she could get under his skin. But even so, the anxiety lingered. Every creak of the gate or rustle in the bushes made him look up. He hated feeling that way in his own home. One night, around 11 p.m., the motion light flicked on again. James grabbed his phone, opened the camera app, and saw her, this time with her dog off the leash wandering near the pool. He could hear her faintly talking on the phone, saying something about proving a point. That was it. He called out from the doorway, his voice steady but firm. "Linda, this is the last time. You need to leave my property and stop coming here. I'm serious." She froze, clearly not expecting him to be awake. "You don't own the neighborhood," she snapped, her voice echoing in the quiet night. "You're not the boss of me." "I don't want to be," he said calmly. "I just want peace." She glared for a long moment, then turned and stormed off again, slamming the gate so hard the latch snapped. James stared at the broken piece of metal and shook his head. Enough warnings, enough patience. The next morning, he printed out photos from his security footage, each labeled with a date and time. He made copies of his notes, too. He didn't want to start a war, but he wasn't going to be pushed around either. If she crossed the line again, he'd take the matter to the proper authorities. That evening, as he sat by the pool, he thought about everything he'd been through. Years of dealing with people, solving conflicts, diffusing tension. He'd always been the calm one, the professional, the voice of reason. But this time it wasn't a stranger on the job. It was his own neighbor in his own backyard. He looked at the water, still and peaceful under the fading light, and made a quiet promise to himself. He wasn't going to let her steal his peace anymore. Not his sleep, not his joy, and definitely not his sense of safety. He was done playing nice. The next time she crossed the line, he'd make sure she finally faced the consequences. The next morning, James woke up feeling more determined than he had in weeks. He had reached his limit. He had tried patience, kindness, and warnings, but none of it worked. Linda had crossed the line too many times, and it was time to do things the right way, by the book. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the folder where he had kept every note and photo, dates, times, screenshots, everything carefully documented. He had even saved copies of the letters from the homeowners association and the pictures she took of his property. Years of police work had trained him to be thorough, and this time that habit would pay off. For the first time, he wasn't angry. He was calm, completely calm. He had seen what anger did to people on the job, how it could twist good intentions and make things worse. He wasn't going to give her that power. By mid-morning, he decided to stop by the local sheriff's office. He had friends there still, though most of them were younger now. He walked in quietly, greeted the clerk at the front desk, and asked to speak with whoever was handling community property disputes. A young deputy came out, polite but professional. "Morning, sir," the deputy said. "What can I do for you?" James smiled slightly. "It's not an emergency, but it's been a long time coming," he said. "I've got a neighbor who's been trespassing on my property. I've warned her multiple times, but she won't stop. I've got photos, videos, and dates if you'd like to see them." The deputy nodded and led him to a small office. James laid out the folder on the desk, explaining everything from the beginning. The uninvited pool visits, the late-night appearances, the property damage, even the broken gate. The deputy listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes. When James finished, the young man said, "You've done everything right, sir. We can file a formal trespassing report and send her a notice. If she ignores it, we'll escalate it from there. It's all on record once you sign." James nodded. "That's all I want, for this to be handled the right way." He signed the paperwork, thanked the deputy, and left the station feeling lighter. It wasn't about revenge or pride. It was about doing things properly. For months he had felt helpless, but now he had taken back control the way he knew best, through patience and procedure. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and the cicadas started to hum, he sat outside by the pool again. The water reflected the orange sky, calm and glassy. He thought about how much energy he had wasted worrying about one person's selfishness. It was strange how someone could turn a quiet life into such chaos. But now things would change. The next afternoon he was trimming the hedges when he saw a sheriff's car roll down the street. It stopped in front of Linda's house. The deputy from the day before stepped out with a folded notice in his hand. James didn't go near. He just kept trimming, pretending not to watch. He could see Linda at her door, looking confused at first, then irritated. She talked for a while, shaking her head, pointing toward James's house a few times. The deputy stayed calm, explaining something, then handed her the papers. She took them with a stiff motion, said something sharp, and slammed the door. The car drove off. James didn't feel joy or satisfaction, just relief. Finally, someone else had seen what he'd been dealing with, someone official. That evening, the street felt unusually quiet. Linda's lights stayed off longer than usual, and for the first time in months, there were no footsteps near the fence, no voices, no movement by the pool. It was peaceful. Days passed, then a week. Everything seemed back to normal. James even started inviting a few friends over again for weekend barbecues. He laughed, played music, and felt like himself again. When his granddaughter visited, she could swim freely without him worrying about anyone showing up uninvited. But peace, he had learned, could be fragile. One Saturday afternoon, he came home from the store to find a note taped to his front door. It was written in a rushed, almost angry hand. The words were short but bitter. "You didn't have to go that far." You could have talked to me like a decent person. Hope you're happy now." He sighed and crumpled the paper. There was no point responding. He had done the right thing, and he wasn't going to be pulled back into another argument. That night, he sat outside again with his book and a glass of lemonade. The air was cool and the sound of crickets filled the background. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. But peace wasn't something Linda could accept easily. A few days later, James received a call from the Homeowners Association. The woman on the line sounded hesitant. "Mr. Walker, I just wanted to let you know that a complaint was filed against you this morning. Someone claimed your pool lights are too bright and are a public disturbance." James almost laughed. "Let me guess who filed it." The woman chuckled softly. "We can't say officially, but yes, you can probably guess. Don't worry though, we'll dismiss it. Your lights are standard and meet all regulations. Just thought you should know." "Thank you," he said, shaking his head. "Some people just don't give up." After that, he started noticing her little attempts to get under his skin, parking closer to his driveway than necessary, leaving her trash bins right next to his, blasting music for an hour before quickly turning it off when he came outside. It was childish, but James refused to react. Every time he felt the frustration rise, he reminded himself, "You already won. You handled it right." One evening, Peter from across the street came over with his dog. "She's been talking again," he said quietly. "Saying you're trying to get her kicked out of the neighborhood." James smiled wearily. "She's got a wild imagination." Peter nodded. "We all know the truth. Everyone's seen her act. You just hang in there." James appreciated that. He realized the other neighbors had noticed everything all along. They just hadn't known how to get involved. A few nights later, he was sitting inside watching TV when the motion camera alert popped up again. His heart skipped, but when he opened the feed, it wasn't Linda. It was the deputy. He stepped outside and found the young man waiting by the gate. "Evening, sir," the deputy said. "Just checking in. Wanted to let you know the warning notice we served was officially recorded. She's been told any further trespassing could lead to a fine." James nodded gratefully. "Appreciate that, officer. She might try to push boundaries again," the deputy added. "But you've got solid documentation. If anything happens, call us right away." "I will," James said. The deputy smiled. "You handled this the right way. Most folks don't have that kind of patience." After the officer left, James sat outside for a long time, thinking about those words. Maybe patience wasn't weakness after all. Maybe it was strength. For the next few weeks, the neighborhood was finally calm. Linda kept her distance. She passed by sometimes, eyes down, pretending not to see him. The tension faded, replaced by quiet. One afternoon, James saw her husband, someone he'd never met before, mowing the lawn. They nodded politely to each other. Maybe she had finally realized this wasn't a game anymore. When James looked back at the pool that evening, he smiled. It shimmered quietly in the sunlight, clean and peaceful again. For the first time in months, he didn't feel the weight of someone's shadow hanging over it. Still, deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't completely over. People like Linda rarely let things end neatly. But at least now he knew he could handle whatever came next. The next morning, he woke up early, brewed a pot of coffee, and went outside as the sun rose. The neighborhood looked peaceful again, just how it was when he first moved in. Birds chirped in the trees. A couple walked their dog down the street, and for once there was no shouting, no unwanted noise, no trespassing. He smiled to himself, breathing in the fresh air. Peace had come back, but this time it was different. It wasn't the kind of peace you get from quiet streets or calm water. It was the kind you earn by standing your ground, not with anger but with dignity. He had done what he had to do, and no matter what happened next, he knew one thing for sure. He'd protected his home, his peace, and his self-respect. A few weeks passed, and life in the neighborhood seemed to return to normal. James enjoyed quiet mornings again. He spent time watering his plants, walking his dog, and chatting with neighbors who had grown friendlier since the whole incident. Most people had heard bits and pieces of what happened, but no one mentioned it directly. It was like the entire street had silently agreed to move on. Still, every now and then, he would glance toward Linda's house. She didn't wave, didn't speak, and rarely stepped outside. It was as if she wanted to pretend nothing had happened. For James, that was fine. He didn't need an apology. All he wanted was peace, but peace can be unpredictable. One bright Monday morning, a thick envelope arrived in his mailbox. Inside was a letter from the county clerk's office, an official court summons. His eyebrows lifted in surprise as he read through it. Linda had filed a complaint against him for harassment and emotional distress. James laughed softly to himself. Of course, he said under his breath. She couldn't let it go. He wasn't angry, though. Years on the force had taught him how to handle things like this and calmly, step by step. He made a few phone calls, contacted a lawyer he knew from his old department, and began preparing everything he needed. When his daughter came over that weekend, he told her what happened. She looked concerned. Dad, this woman really won't stop, huh? James smiled and shook his head. Some people need to learn the hard way. But I'm not worried. I've got the truth on my side. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. During that time, James went through all his notes again. He printed the photos, copied the video files, and organized everything in a binder. It felt strange being on the other side of the courtroom experience, not as an officer or witness, but as someone defending himself. Still, he was confident. On the morning of the hearing, he dressed neatly in a light gray suit and arrived early. The courthouse was quiet, sunlight streaming through the windows. He sat down on one of the benches outside the courtroom and waited. A few minutes later, Linda arrived, looking tense and slightly flustered. She avoided his gaze as she checked in with the clerk. Her expression carried that same stubborn pride he'd seen so many times before. When their case was called, they both stepped inside. The room was small, just the judge, a clerk, and a few empty seats. It wasn't dramatic like the courtrooms you see on TV. It was simple, quiet, and serious. The judge, a middle-aged woman with kind but sharp eyes, looked over the papers. All right, she said. This case involves a complaint of harassment and property disputes between two neighboring homeowners. Mrs. Perkins, you're the plaintiff. Please tell the court what happened. Linda took a deep breath and began to speak. Her story was full of exaggerations. She claimed James had been spying on her with cameras, had intimidated her by calling the police, and had embarrassed her in front of the neighbors. She painted herself as the victim of constant bullying. James didn't interrupt. He just listened quietly, keeping his face calm. Years of being in court had taught him the importance of patience. When she finished, the judge turned to him. Mr. Walker, you may respond. James stood up slowly. His voice was steady but gentle. Your Honor, I spent 25 years serving this community as a police officer. I've seen real harassment. This isn't that. This is about a neighbor who refused to respect boundaries. He placed the binder on the desk. Here are the photos of her and her guests using my pool without permission. Here are the security videos showing repeated trespassing. Here are the notices I sent and the written warnings from the homeowners association. I never harassed her. I simply protected my home. The judge flipped through the evidence carefully. The photos were clear. The timestamps matched. The letters were polite and professional. Everything was organized, factual, and undeniable. After several minutes, the judge looked up. Mrs. Perkins, did you have permission to use his pool? Linda hesitated. It's just a pool. It's in the open. I didn't think it was a big deal. The judge sighed softly. It's private property. Permission matters. Linda started to speak again, but the judge raised her hand gently. Enough. I've heard enough. The room was silent. Mr. Walker, the judge said, it's clear that you handled this situation properly and with restraint. You documented everything, followed protocol, and never retaliated in any harmful way. Mrs. Perkins, your complaint is dismissed. Furthermore, based on this evidence, I'm ruling in favor of Mr. Walker for damages to his property and for legal costs associated with this case. James nodded respectfully. He didn't smile or gloat. He simply said, Thank you, Your Honor. Linda looked stunned. She opened her mouth to argue, but the judge had already moved on to the next case. The clerk handed each of them a copy of the ruling, and that was that. As they left the courtroom, Linda brushed past him without a word. For a moment, he felt almost sorry for her, not because of the ruling, but because she had made things so much harder for herself. All she had to do was say sorry once, and it could have all ended months ago. When James got home that afternoon, he placed the folder on his shelf and made himself a quiet lunch. He sat outside by the pool again, the water shimmering gently under the sun. It felt different now. Peaceful, yes, but also complete. A few days later, he started noticing small changes. Linda and her family began cleaning up their yard. Her husband put up new fencing on their side higher than before. She no longer parked near his driveway. She didn't even look in his direction. Maybe at last she had learned her lesson. The other neighbors started greeting him more warmly. Some even congratulated him quietly. One older couple said, "You handled that better than anyone else could have." He smiled and thanked them, but deep down he didn't feel triumphant. He felt grateful that it was finally over, that he could enjoy his home again without tension. A week later, a small envelope arrived in his mailbox. No name, no return address, just a short handwritten note. It said, "I'm sorry for everything. I went too far. I shouldn't have done it." He read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in the drawer of his desk. He didn't need to respond. That note was enough. The next morning he went for a walk around the neighborhood. The air was cool and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. He stopped for a moment and looked back at his house, the home he had worked so hard for. For the first time in months, it looked exactly as it should, calm, safe, and inviting. He thought about all he had learned through the ordeal. Sometimes peace isn't something that just happens. Sometimes you have to fight for it, not with anger or shouting, but with patience, proof, and self-control. As he stood there, he felt proud, not just for winning the case, but for how he had handled himself. It wasn't about making someone pay. It was about standing firm without losing who he was. That evening, his daughter called. "How are you feeling now that it's all done, Dad?" James chuckled. "Like I can finally sit by my pool without checking the cameras every 5 minutes." She laughed. "You deserve that peace, Dad, you really do." He hung up, walked outside, and sat on the lounge chair. The sunset painted the sky in soft orange and gold. The water reflected the colors perfectly, still and quiet. He thought about how life had come full circle, from the moment he built the pool to the long months of frustration, and finally, to this peaceful evening. He had lost his temper once or twice in his mind, but never in action. He had stayed true to himself even when it wasn't easy. As the light faded, he smiled and whispered to himself, "This is how it's supposed to be." For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like a retired officer trying to keep control. He just felt like a man enjoying the simple peace of his home. The wind rustled the trees, the cicadas began their evening song, and the faint smell of fresh-cut grass lingered in the air. James leaned back, closed his eyes, and listened to the sounds of calm. The neighborhood around him was quiet again, not because someone had lost, but because respect had finally been restored. And that to him was worth more than any fine or apology.